Imagine being treated like dirt by the man who is about to beg you for his job. If Sophie Calder had known she'd be spending 3 hours on a stiff wooden bench, she would have chosen a uniform with a bit more flexibility. The rough blue polyester she wore was scratchy against her skin, a far cry from the silk blends she usually favoured for high-stakes meetings. But there she was, tucked into a corner of the massive logistics headquarters in downtown, a mop propped against her shoulder like a silent sentinel. She had prepared for this for months, not the cleaning but the observation. She had imagined every way a man like Victor Langford might overlook her, but she hadn't expected the sheer weight of the silence. She was the first to arrive, 3 hours before the scheduled board meeting, ready to see the side of the company that never shows up in the annual reports. Inside the lobby, the air smelled of industrial cleaner and the sharp metallic tang of cold air conditioning. Sophie leaned slightly on her mop, her blue cleaning gloves resting on her knees as a receptionist with a perfectly smooth bun ignored her entirely. The heavy glass doors swung open and Victor Langford marched in. He didn't just walk, he owned the space, his dark suit perfectly tailored and his light stubble giving him the look of a man too busy for a razor. He stopped at the front desk, not 5 feet from Sophie, and crossed his arms. "Any sign of the new SVP?" Victor asked, his voice booming with a smug confidence. The receptionist shook her head without looking up. Victor sighed, a sound of pure impatience, and glanced at his watch. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the lobby until it landed on Sophie. For a split second, their eyes met. Victor didn't see a strategist, he didn't see a peer, he saw a nuisance. "Hey you," he snapped, pointing a manicured finger at a spot on the marble floor near Sophie's feet. "There's a scuff mark right there. Since you're just sitting around, why don't you make yourself useful and get it out before the real guests arrive?" Sophie didn't blink. She simply looked at the floor, then back at him, her expression serious and unimpressed. "I'll get right on that, sir," she said quietly. Victor let out a faint, dismissive laugh and turned his back on her, returning his focus to the elevators. 5 minutes passed, then 15, then 45. Sophie watched as Victor greeted 2 other men in suits, laughing about a weekend at the club while she remained a shadow on the bench. The air around her grew heavier. She watched him check his watch for the 10th time, his face twisting into a mask of irritation because the important person was late, never realizing she had been there the whole time. It wasn't a decision Sophie Calder had made lightly. For weeks, the executive search committee had touted this logistics giant as a family-oriented powerhouse, a place where integrity was baked into the foundation. But Sophie knew that the view from the penthouse was always distorted. She had seen too many brilliant companies hollowed out from the inside by middle management who smiled at the board and stepped on the neck of the warehouse staff. If she was going to lead this firm as its new senior vice president, she wouldn't do it based on a curated PowerPoint presentation and a series of polite dinners. She needed to know what happened when the important people weren't looking. The plan had formed in the early hours of the morning, 2 days before her official start date. She had gone to a small uniform supply shop on the edge of town, far from the polished glass towers of the financial district. There she had traded her Italian wool blazer for the stiff, unyielding blue polyester. She had bought a pair of thick cleaning gloves and a heavy-duty mop, the wooden handle worn smooth by someone else's years of labor. Looking at herself in the shop's cracked mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the strategist who could dismantle a failing supply chain in an afternoon. In her place was a worker, someone whose presence was required but whose personhood was optional. Her mentor had warned her it was a risk. "If they catch you, Sophie, they'll call it a stunt. They'll say you're playing games with their reputation." "I'm not playing games," she had replied, her voice as steady as it was now on the lobby bench. "I'm conducting an audit. You can't judge the health of a tree by looking only at the fruit, you have to look at the soil." When she arrived at the headquarters at 7:00 a.m., she didn't enter through the grand revolving doors. She went around to the service entrance, trailing behind a group of actual custodial staff who were too tired to notice a new face. She had spent the first hour in the stairwells and the break rooms, listening. She heard the hushed complaints about unpaid overtime and the jokes about the god complex of the regional managers. But it was Victor Langford's name that kept surfacing, a man described as a king on a cardboard throne. By 8:00 a.m. she had positioned herself in the main lobby. She sat on the bench, propping her mop beside her, and watched the world transition from the early morning cleaners to the high-powered suits. She felt the shift in the air immediately. The warmth of the morning crew was replaced by a sterile, frantic energy. People looked through her. They walked around her mop as if it were a trip hazard, never making eye contact. Sophie felt a strange, cold clarity settling in her chest. Every dismissive glance from a passing junior associate, every "excuse me" whispered with a tone of annoyance, was a data point. She wasn't just sitting, she was mapping the culture. By the time Victor Langford's polished Oxfords hit the marble floor, Sophie had already seen enough to know that the family culture the board had promised was a lie. Now she just had to see how far the rot went. Victor Langford didn't just enter a room, he staged an arrival. The heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open with a rhythmic whoosh as he stepped inside, his presence immediately pulling the air out of the space. He was the picture of corporate success, his dark suit catching the morning light, and his light stubble suggesting a man who was far too busy conquering the market to bother with a morning shave. He didn't look at the people around him. He looked over them, his eyes fixed on the elevator bank, as if the sheer force of his will could make the doors open faster. He stopped at the front desk, his movements sharp and precise. Without a word of greeting, he tapped the face of his watch, a heavy gold-rimmed piece that probably cost more than a janitor's yearly salary. The receptionist, who had been focused on her screen, straightened her posture instantly. "Mr. Langford, good morning," she stammered, her voice losing its previous professional cool. "The 10:00 a.m. guest," Victor said, his voice a rich, practiced baritone that carried easily across the marble floor. "Has she checked in?" "Not yet, sir. I've been watching the entrance closely." Victor let out a huff of air, a sound of pure, unadulterated impatience. He turned away from the desk, his arms crossing over his chest in a defensive, power-hungry stance. His gaze swept the lobby, landing momentarily on the blurred figures of colleagues shaking hands in the distance before finally dragging across the bench where Sophie sat. For a moment his eyes stopped. Sophie felt the weight of that look. It wasn't the look of a man seeing a human being, it was the look of a homeowner spotting a stain on the carpet. To Victor, she was a blemish on the pristine, high-end image of his lobby. He didn't notice the intelligence behind her steady gaze or the fact that her posture, though slightly slouched for the role, remained unshakable. He saw blue polyester, rubber gloves, and a mop. He didn't speak to her directly at first. Instead, he turned back to the receptionist, gesturing towards Sophie with a flick of his wrist. "Why is she still sitting there? This isn't a bus station. The board is going to be here in less than an hour, and I want this place looking like a cathedral, not a break room." "She's just waiting for the service elevator to clear, sir," the receptionist whispered, her eyes darting nervously to Sophie. Victor turned back towards Sophie, taking a step closer. The smell of his expensive cologne, sharp and aggressive, hit her before he spoke. "You," he said, the word landing like a slap. "If you're on the clock, you should be moving. I don't pay people to decorate the furniture." Sophie gripped the wooden handle of her mop a little tighter, her expression remaining serious and unimpressed. She didn't look down. She didn't apologize. She simply watched him, recording the way his lip curled in a faint, smug smile, the smile of a man who believed he was the most important person in the building. "I'm just waiting for my instructions, sir," she said, her voice intentionally neutral. Victor laughed, a short, dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Instructions? Here's an instruction, get out of my sight. Go find a corner to scrub until you're needed. People like you are supposed to be felt, not seen." He checked his watch again, dismissed her with a final, cutting glance, and walked toward the elevators, leaving a trail of arrogance in his wake that was thicker than any dust she could ever hope to mop up. Sophie watched his retreating back, her calm demeanor hiding the cold realization that the audit had already provided its first, damning result. Victor hadn't walked more than 10 feet toward the elevators before he stopped abruptly. He stood there for a moment, his back to Sophie, his shoulders rising with a sharp, calculated breath. It was as if he realized that simply dismissing her wasn't enough to satisfy the irritation bubbling under his expensive white collar. He needed to assert a more tangible form of dominance, to remind himself, and the lobby at large, exactly where the lines were drawn. He turned back around, his eyes scanning the floor with predatory intent. He wasn't looking for a real mess, he was looking for an excuse. His gaze settled on a small, nearly invisible streak of condensation near a large potted palm, likely left by a delivery person earlier that morning. It was a nothing mark, the kind of imperfection that a high-traffic marble floor naturally accumulates. But to Victor, it was an opportunity. "Wait," he called out, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He marched back toward the bench, stopping just short of Sophie's boots. He didn't look at her face this time, he looked down at her mop. "I thought I told you to get to work, look at this." He jabbed a finger toward the dry patch of marble. Is this what passes for clean in your department? Sophie stood up slowly. She didn't rush and she didn't show the flustered anxiety Victor clearly expected. She leaned the mop against her shoulder and looked down at the spot he was pointing to. It was bone dry. "There's nothing there, sir," she said, her voice steady and flat. Victor's face reddened, the stubble on his jaw tightening. "Are you talking back to me? I said there's a spill, a hazardous, slippery mess that could cause one of my board members to break a hip." To emphasize his point, he reached for a half-full bottle of expensive mineral water sitting on the edge of the receptionist's desk. With a slow, deliberate tilt of his hand, he poured the contents onto the floor. The water splashed against the marble, spreading in a mocking, clear puddle right between Sophie's feet. "There," Victor said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous purr. "Now there's a spill, clean it, and don't stop until I can see my reflection in that stone." The receptionist gasped softly, then quickly ducked her head, her fingers flying across her keyboard to avoid witnessing the humiliation. Sophie looked at the water, then up at Victor. She saw the smug, self-satisfied glint in his eyes, the look of a man who felt powerful only when he was making someone else feel small. This wasn't about maintenance, it was a performance of cruelty. Sophie didn't argue, she didn't give him the satisfaction of a protest. She reached down, adjusted her blue cleaning gloves and gripped the mop handle. As she began to push the water across the floor in slow, rhythmic strokes, she felt Victor's shadow looming over her. He stayed there for a long minute, watching her work, his arms crossed as if he were supervising a critical operation. "Better," he muttered, loud enough for the passing junior executives to hear. "Maybe if you put a little more heart into your work, you wouldn't be stuck in that uniform." He turned on his heel and strode away, laughing a little as he joined a group of men by the elevators. Sophie continued to mop, her movements calm and mechanical. She wasn't angry, she was focused. Every drop of water she soaked up was another piece of evidence. Victor Langford thought he was testing a janitor's obedience, but Sophie Calder was actually testing his character, and he had just failed the final exam. The elevators remained stubbornly still, leaving Victor and his entourage anchored near the center of the lobby. To anyone else, the space was a marvel of modern architecture, but to Victor, it had become a waiting room that was beneath his dignity. He stood near a towering column of glass and steel, just a few feet from where Sophie was meticulously finishing the task he had manufactured for her. He had forgotten her existence the moment she bent her back to the floor, dismissing her as a permanent fixture of the room's geography. Still no word, Victor's voice cut through the air, sharp with an entitlement that made the junior managers around him shift their weight. One of them, a man named Marcus who looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours, checked his tablet nervously. "Her car should be here any minute, Mr. Langford. The board is already upstairs in the executive lounge." Victor scoffed, a dry, grating sound. 3 hours. I've been standing in this fishbowl for 3 hours waiting for a woman who probably got her position through a diversity quota and a flashy degree from a school that's never seen a day of actual labor. This new senior VP doesn't know the first thing about how we run things on the ground. Sophie moved her mop closer, the wet threads whispering against the marble. She stayed in his peripheral vision, a silent ghost in blue polyester. "The board is high on this cultural shift nonsense," Victor continued, leaning in toward Marcus, though he made no effort to lower his volume. "They want empathy. They want valuing every link in the chain. Do you know what happens when you value every link? The chain gets heavy and the machine stops moving. You don't lead a firm like this by holding hands with the people who empty the trash. You lead it by making sure they're afraid enough of losing their seat at the table that they don't dare slow down." Marcus nodded quickly, a forced parasitic agreement. "Of course, Victor, it's about results." "Exactly," Victor snapped. "Results, these people, the warehouse crews, the drivers, the help, their numbers, their line items. You start treating them like they have a voice, and suddenly everyone wants a raise and a say in how the shifts are run. I've spent 5 years cleaning out the dead weight. If this Calder woman thinks she's going to come in here and undo my discipline with some soft-hearted HR initiatives, she's in for a very short tenure. I'll make sure the board realizes she's a liability before her first quarter is up." He paused to check his gold watch again, his light stubble catching the light as he sneered. "I'm the one who keeps the wheels turning. I'm the one who knows who to squeeze and who to break. The day I start caring about the feelings of someone in a blue jumpsuit is the day I hand in my keys." Sophie's grip on the mop handle didn't falter. She didn't let a single muscle in her face betray the cold, clinical fury rising within her. She wasn't just hearing a manager complain, she was hearing a confession of institutional rot. Victor wasn't a leader, he was a bottleneck, a man who viewed his subordinates as obstacles rather than assets. The ding of the executive elevator echoed through the lobby. Victor straightened his tie, the smug, predatory smile returning to his face. He wiped any trace of his vitriol away, replacing it with a mask of professional anticipation. He was ready to greet his new boss with a handshake and a lie, completely unaware that the dead weight he had just finished insulting was standing right behind him, holding a mop. The clock on the lobby wall was a silent, ticking judge. It had been exactly 3 hours since Sophie first took her seat, and the physical reality of the charade was beginning to settle into her bones. The wooden bench, which had felt merely firm at 7:00 a.m., now felt like a slab of sun-baked stone. A dull ache radiated from her lower back, creeping up her spine, a reminder that the human body wasn't designed for the stillness of the invisible. The heat inside the blue polyester uniform was oppressive. The fabric didn't breathe, it trapped the warmth of her skin, making the scratchy collar feel like a slow-burning fuse against her neck. Her hands, encased in the thick rubber of the cleaning gloves, were damp with sweat, the latex clinging to her skin in a way that made her want to tear them off. But she didn't move. She remained a statue of blue and grit, her posture steady despite the fatigue. Mental exhaustion was harder to mask. For 180 minutes, she had been the target of a psychological bombardment. It wasn't just Victor's overt cruelty, it was the cumulative weight of 1,000 small dismissals. She watched as junior associates used the lobby's trash can near her feet, tossing crumpled coffee cups with such careless aim that liquid splashed onto her boots, followed by not so much as a glance of apology. She listened to the shhh of silk skirts and the clack of expensive heels as people discussed million-dollar deals over her head, treating her presence as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. Each minute was a test of her resolve, a part of her, the part that had spent a decade fighting for a seat at the world's most exclusive tables, wanted to stand up, strip off the gloves, and demand the respect her resume commanded. She wanted to see the look on Victor's face if she spoke in the crisp, authoritative tone that usually silenced boardrooms, but she stayed down. She forced herself to feel the sting of the mockery, to let the weight of the janitor label settle over her until she truly understood the cost of Victor's leadership. Victor himself was now packing a tight circle near the elevators, his impatience reaching a fever pitch. He had moved past irritation and into a state of visible, twitchy arrogance. Every few minutes he would cast a glance toward the bench, his eyes full of a strange, petty loathing. "Still there," he muttered as he passed, loud enough for a nearby intern to snicker. "God, the laziness in this building is a disease. You'd think she'd find a wall to lean on in the back where she doesn't ruin the view." Sophie didn't look up, but she felt the heat of his words. The mocking was no longer just about the spill or the work, it was about her existence in his space. She realized then that to Victor, people were either tools to be used or obstacles to be cleared. There was no middle ground. As the 3-hour mark passed, the air in the lobby seemed to sharpen. The distant hum of the city outside faded, replaced by the electric tension of the impending arrival. Sophie took a slow, deep breath, tasting the lemon-scented air. The physical pain in her back and the damp heat of the gloves were no longer burdens, they were fuel. She had reached the limit of her observation. She had seen the soil and it was poisoned. Now the wait is almost over. The pressure cooker was at its limit, and the ding of the elevator wasn't just a sound. It was a signal that the time for watching had ended, and the time for dismantling was about to begin. The stillness of the lobby was shattered not by a shout, but by a sound so subtle it felt like a shift in atmospheric pressure. The executive elevator, a sleek column of brushed steel and frosted glass that had remained dormant all morning, let out a soft, melodic chime. It was a sound that commanded instant Pavlovian obedience. Victor Langford reacted as if he had been struck by a live wire. He snapped to attention, his crossed arms falling to his sides, his shoulders squaring under his dark suit jacket. The smug, bored expression he had worn for hours vanished, replaced by a mask of eager, high-stakes professionalism. Around him, the junior managers and the receptionist seemed to hold their breath. The air, which had been heavy with the stagnant scent of industrial lemon and Victor's arrogance, suddenly crackled with the electric charge of real power. The doors slid open with a hushed, expensive whir. A group of 5 people stepped out, moving with a synchronized gravity that made the high-ceilinged room feel small. These were the architects of the firm, the board of directors. They didn't scurry or rush, they moved with the deliberate pace of people who owned every second of the day. At the center was Arthur Vance, the chairman, a man whose white hair and sharp, hawkish eyes had terrified more than one CEO into early retirement. Victor stepped forward, his hand already extended, a practiced sycophantic smile plastered across his face. "Mr. Vance, welcome back. We've been anticipating your arrival. Everything is prepared for the strategy session. I've personally seen the lobby's presentation. We wanted it to be perfect for the new SVP." He shot a quick, venomous glance toward the bench where Sophie sat, a silent reminder that he considered her the only flaw in his otherwise perfect stage. Arthur Vance didn't take Victor's hand. He didn't even look at him. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes scanning the lobby with a clinical intensity that made Victor's smile falter. The other board members stopped behind him, their gazes following him. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. Victor's extended hand began to tremble almost imperceptibly as the seconds stretched. He opened his mouth to speak again, perhaps to apologize for the janitor, still sitting on the bench, but the words died in his throat. Sophie felt the electricity moving toward her. She didn't look up yet. She kept her eyes on the polished marble floor she had been forced to mop. She felt the weight of the board's presence, the heavy, silent judgment of the people who had entrusted her with the future of their company. "Is there a problem, sir?" Victor finally managed to croak, his voice cracking under the strain of the silence. "If it's the custodial staff, I've already handled it. She's being removed immediately." Arthur Vance finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that made the glass walls of the lobby vibrate. "Handle it, Victor. You've spent the last 3 hours handling the most important investment this firm has made in a decade." The chairman stepped past Victor, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the stone. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of the wooden bench. Behind him, the rest of the board followed suit, forming a semicircle of power around the woman in the blue polyester uniform. The electric tension in the room reached a breaking point, and for the first time in 3 hours, Sophie Calder finally raised her head. The silence in the lobby was no longer heavy, it was absolute. Victor stood frozen, his hand still half extended in a pathetic, unrequited gesture of welcome. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird as he watched Arthur Vance, the man who decided the fates of continents, bow his head slightly toward the woman on the bench. Sophie moved with a deliberate, slow grace. She didn't scramble to her feet like a servant caught resting. Instead, she reached up and peeled the thick, sweat-dampened blue gloves from her hands. The sound of the rubber snapping against her skin was as sharp as a gunshot in the hushed room. She set them neatly on the wooden bench beside her, revealing hands that were steady and unshakable. Arthur Vance stepped closer, his face breaking into a look of genuine respect that he hadn't shown once to Victor. He ignored the mop propped against the bench. He ignored the scratchy, water-stained polyester. He looked directly into Sophie's unimpressed, steel-grey eyes. "We were beginning to wonder if you'd seen enough," Vance said, his voice carrying the weight of a decree. He reached out not to dismiss her, but to offer a firm, welcoming hand. "Welcome to the team, Senior Vice President Calder." The words hit Victor like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen grey that clashed with the dark precision of his suit. His knees felt weak, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. SVP Calder. The name echoed in his mind, colliding with every insult he had hurled, every spill he had forced her to scrub, and every dismissive laugh he had shared at her expense. Sophie took the chairman's hand. Her grip was firm, her gaze never wavering from Vance's. "I've seen more than enough, Arthur," she said, her voice had changed. The quiet, neutral tone of the janitor was gone, replaced by a crisp, authoritative resonance that commanded the very air in the lobby. "The soil here is exactly as I suspected, perhaps even a bit more congested than the reports suggested." "I imagine so," Vance replied, his jaw tightening. Victor tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, wheezing sound came out. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands trembling. "Mr. Vance, Arthur, there's been a massive misunderstanding. I thought she was. I was maintaining the standards of the lobby. I had no idea." Sophie turned her head slowly, finally fixing her gaze on Victor. It was the first time she had looked at him as an equal, and the sheer power in her eyes made him recoil. There was no anger in her expression, only a cold, clinical assessment that was far more terrifying. "You knew exactly who I was, Victor," she said, her voice dropping to a level that felt like a blade. "You didn't know my name or my title, but you knew I was a person standing in your lobby. You knew I was a worker under your care, and you chose to show me exactly how you treat those you think are beneath you." She stood tall, the blue uniform no longer looking like a disguise but like a set of armor. The board members stepped back, clearing a path not for Victor, but for her. "The board is waiting for us upstairs," Vance said, gesturing toward the executive elevator. Sophie nodded, but she didn't move yet. She looked at the mop, then back at the man who had tried to break her spirit for 3 hours. "The standards of this lobby are about to change, Victor, starting with the people allowed to stand in it." The executive elevator remained open, its soft light spilling onto the marble floor like a spotlight on a crime scene. Victor felt the walls of the lobby, his kingdom, closing in. The air, once filled with his booming voice, now felt thin and suffocating. He looked at Sophie, then at the board, then back at the blue polyester uniform that had tricked him so completely. The realization of what he had done didn't arrive as a single wave. It hit him in jagged, terrifying shards. "SVP Calder," he whispered, the title tasting like ash. "Sophie, I can explain. We have a very specific protocol for custodial staff. I was merely ensuring that the corporate image." "The corporate image," Sophie cut him off. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room, silencing the whispering junior managers. "Is the corporate image built on manufactured spills and public humiliation, Victor? Or is it built on the backs of the people you called line items and dead weight just 20 minutes ago?" Victor's heart skipped a beat. The blood that had drained from his face now rushed back in a hot, shameful crawl. His mind raced through the morning, replaying every word he'd muttered to Marcus while Sophie had been mopping at his feet. The insults about diversity quotas, the jokes about her education. The cold, calculated admission that he led through fear and intended to break the new executive before her first quarter was up. He had said it all, thinking he was speaking into a void. He hadn't realized he was speaking into a recorder. I was under a lot of stress," Victor stammered, his hands fluttering toward his tie as if straightening it could fix his crumbling life. "The pressure of the transition, the board's expectations. I may have been vent." "You weren't venting," Sophie said, taking a single step toward him. The height difference didn't matter. She loomed over him with the weight of absolute moral authority. "You were revealing the rot. You told me that the day you start caring about the feelings of someone in a blue jumpsuit is the day you hand in your keys. Well, Victor, today is that day." Victor looked around the semicircle of board members. He looked for a glimmer of sympathy, a nod of shared corporate understanding, but he found only stony, unblinking silence. Even Marcus, who had been his loyal shadow all morning, had stepped back into the crowd, eyes fixed on the floor, distancing himself from the sinking ship. "You don't understand the ground-level logistics," Victor pleaded, his voice rising to a frantic, desperate pitch. "I've increased margins by 15%, I've streamlined the entire regional chain. You can't let one morning, one misunderstanding, undo 5 years of results." "Results bought with the dignity of your employees are not results, Victor, they are debts," Sophie replied. She reached down and picked up the mop, holding it out toward him. The gesture was silent, but the meaning was deafening. He had spent the morning trying to put her in her place. Now she was showing him exactly where his place had always been. The mask of the confident, untouchable manager hadn't just slipped, it had shattered into 1,000 pieces. Victor stood in the center of the lobby, a man in a $5,000 suit who had never looked smaller, more exposed, or more utterly powerless. The transition was swift and surgical. Sophie didn't wait for Victor to find his words or for the lobby to regain its composure. She simply turned toward the executive elevator, the blue polyester of her uniform rustling with a new, sharp authority. Arthur Vance and the rest of the board fell into step behind her, a phalanx of power that moved with a singular purpose. As the doors began to close, the last thing Sophie saw was Victor standing paralyzed in the center of the marble floor, the mop she had offered him still leaning against the bench like a discarded scepter. Upstairs, the boardroom was a sanctuary of glass and silence, a far cry from the lemon-scented heat of the lobby. Sophie didn't ask for a moment to change. She sat at the head of the mahogany table, her scratchy blue sleeves resting against the polished wood. She looked at the faces of the directors, men and women who had spent years looking at spreadsheets and ignoring the humans behind the numbers. "The audit is complete," Sophie said, her voice echoing with a finality that brooked no argument. "The margins Victor Langford boasted about were subsidized by the morale of every worker in this building. That ends today. We are not just a logistics firm, we are a community of thousands. And if the leadership doesn't understand that the person holding the mop is as vital as the person signing the checks, then that leadership is a liability." While Sophie laid out her vision for a transparent, respect-based culture, a different kind of movement was happening on the floor below. Two security guards stood at Victor's corner office, their expressions as impassive as the stone in the lobby. Victor's desk, once a monument to his ego, was being systematically dismantled. His gold-rimmed watch sat on the blotter, catching the light one last time before being shoved into a cardboard box alongside his framed awards and his designer desk toys. There was no farewell lunch, no handshake, and no opportunity to explain. The man who had spent 5 years making people afraid of losing their seats had finally lost his own. By noon, the atmosphere in the building had begun to shift. The news of the janitor VP had spread through the breakrooms and warehouse floors like a wildfire of hope. The receptionist with the manicured bun found herself looking up and actually seeing the people who walked through the front doors. The junior managers, once sycophants to Victor's cruelty, were suddenly very quiet, re-evaluating the way they spoke to their subordinates. Sophie finally stood up from the boardroom table and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. She felt the stiffness in her back and the lingering itch of the polyester, but she didn't move to change. She wanted to remember the weight of the uniform. She wanted to remember the cold, invisible feeling of the bench. A new era had begun. It wasn't just about changing a nameplate or a policy manual. It was about a fundamental shift in the soul of the company. As the sun reached its zenith, Sophie Calder looked down at her hands, clean, strong, and no longer hidden by rubber gloves. She had spent 3 hours being treated like she was nothing, only to ensure that from this day forward, everyone in this building would be treated like they were everything. 6 months later, the lobby of the logistics headquarters felt like a different world. The air no longer carried that sharp, suffocating scent of industrial lemon and anxiety. Instead, it felt open, sunlight streaming across a floor that was clean, but no longer treated like a sacred, untouchable museum. Sophie Calder stepped through the front doors, this time through the main revolving entrance. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, the silk lining a soft contrast to the memory of the scratchy polyester that had once defined her first day. She didn't head straight for the private executive elevators. Instead, she stopped at the front desk. "Morning, Alina," Sophie said, leaning against the marble. The receptionist, the same woman with the once perfect bun, smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression. "Good morning, Sophie. The coffee in the break room is fresh, and the warehouse leads are already in the courtyard for the town hall." Sophie nodded, noticing the small changes. There was a new seating area with comfortable chairs, and the stiff wooden bench where she had sat for 3 hours was gone, replaced by a community board featuring photos of Employee of the Month across every department, drivers, loaders, and analysts standing side by side. As she walked toward the courtyard, she passed a man in a blue uniform similar to the one she had once worn. He was buffing a corner of the floor. As Sophie passed, she didn't look through him. She stopped. "The finish looks great, David," she said, reading his name tag. "But don't kill yourself on that corner. We're more worried about the safety briefing at 10. Make sure you're there. I want your input on the new floor grips." The man looked up, surprised and then proud. "I'll be there, Miss Calder, thank you." Outside. The atmosphere was electric. This wasn't the family culture Victor Langford had lied about. It was a partnership. Sophie stood on a small platform in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by hundreds of employees in suits, high-visibility vests and denim. There was no hierarchy in the way they stood, just a collective of people building something together. In the distance, the shadow of Victor Langford was long gone. Word had reached the office that he was struggling to find a firm that would tolerate his results at all costs philosophy in a market that was increasingly demanding accountability. He had become a cautionary tale, a ghost of a corporate era that was rapidly fading into irrelevance. Sophie looked out at the faces of her team. She still kept the old blue polyester uniform in a small, discreet box in the bottom drawer of her executive desk. She didn't keep it as a trophy, but as a compass. It was a reminder that the view from the top is only as clear as the respect you have for the foundation. 6 months ago I sat in that lobby, she began, her voice amplified and steady. I sat there to see if this company had a soul. Today, looking at all of you, I don't have to wonder anymore. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, forced clapping of a boardroom. It was a roar, the sound of a machine that finally had all its parts working in harmony, led by a woman who knew that to lead the people, you first had to be willing to sit among them.